In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the rear brakes, pads, and rotors on this GMC Terrain. Let's install these TRQ brakes. Before you start replacing the rear brakes, just so you know, you do need a scan tool to retract the rear parking brake motor or actuator so that you can safely perform this repair. Right before you release the parking brake actuator, it is a good idea on these vehicles to remove the brake master cylinder reservoir cap so it can release any pressure that might come out. The first step is going to hold the start button or the engine on button. That way the ignition turns on to the on position. Make sure your foot is not on the brake for this. With your scan tool plugged in, go into the appropriate vehicle. This might not look the same on your device, but for me, I have to go into anti-lock brakes. Once it loads, I'm going to go into functional tests and then output controls. This is going to allow me to scroll through this list and find the parking brake release. There we go, rear brake caliper piston retract. And now I'm going to release it. As you could hear, there was some beeping going on inside, but also the motors outside were operating and have released the parking brake. So we're going to exit this. We can now shut this off and shut the ignition off. And now we can perform our repair. And now that this is all released and done, I'm going to cap it back off so that air, moisture doesn't make its way in the brake fluid as well as any debris. With a 19mm socket, remove the 5 lug nuts that hold the wheel on and remove the wheel. With a 13mm wrench or socket, break free the 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. In a lot of cases, the slider pin will spin with the bolt. I have a thin wrench. This is an 11/16. If you don't have this, you might be able to use a regular wrench if it's thin enough, or some pliers. Just be careful of the boot. That will hold the slider pin for you while you unthread the bolt. If you have a ratcheting wrench, that'll make things go a lot faster. Once you have it most of the way out, you'll be able to remove it by hand. The reason this happens is because there's quite a bit of thread locker on them from the factory. I am going to leave this one in a couple threads so it can hold the caliper while I undo the bottom one. Remove the bottom, remove the top once again, then you can pull the caliper off, set it aside. However you set it aside, you want to make sure that it's not pulling on either the actuator wire or the parking brake hose, so I'm just going to flip it over and leave it right here on this trailing arm. Next, we'll be able to remove the pads. If they're stuck, you can use a pry bar to tap them out. Next, we have to remove the caliper bracket off of the knuckle. To get this off, we'll need to take this 18mm bolt out, and there's another one that you can't really see, but it's right in this cutout right there. And to access this one, you can either stick a socket through here, or this opening on the trailing arm will allow you to get an extension with a socket through it. I'm going to have to break these free by hand first. You can either continue removing them by hand or with a power tool if you have one that fits in there. This one's out, but I will leave it in a few threads, just like for the caliper. That way it holds the bracket on while I remove the lower. Okay, take the bolt out and remove the caliper bracket. The rotor will be held on with a T40 Torx bolt. Hopefully yours is not stuck. A lot of times these do get stuck. If yours is and it won't come off easily, hit it with a punch in the center and that should help break it free. If you're using a power tool on it as opposed to an impacting screwdriver, be very careful not to either strip this out or break your bit. Now remove the rotor. Now we have to clean the hub surface. It's fairly rusty on the outside, but it's not completely rotted. So a wire brush should do the trick, but you want to make sure you have a nice flat surface for the new rotor to mount on. The outside is now pretty clean. I'm not looking for perfection. The inside I'll hit with a larger wire brush so that it can get into the grooves here, or between the studs and the center bore of the hub. This part is greased up already, so I'm going to want to remove all that grease with some brake parts cleaner so we can apply new anti-seize. Have a collection bucket underneath to collect all of your brake parts cleaner. That's going to drip down. Spray this all down so we can get rid of any grease, oils, and debris. I'm going to coat this with some anti-seize. Don't put too much on. If you do, it'll basically fling out. It'll get squished out by the rotor and it'll start flinging out. That's not what you want. What you want is a thin layer to prevent corrosion from building up and the rotor from seizing on here in the future. Next time it has to be removed. If you have the spray kind, try not to get it on the threads of the lug studs. If you have the brushed kind, unfortunately a lot of these bristles do end up falling off, so make sure you don't get too many on here. What you're looking for is, once again, an even layer all the way around. Now you'll notice that the outer lip here is raised as well as the inner lip. The center is kind of carved out and the rotor actually sits on the outside and on the inside, not so much on the center, but I will coat the center because if you leave it bare and it corrodes, it can start pushing out on the rotor from rust building up. This looks pretty good, even coverage, so let's put the rotor on. I'm going to mount it backwards first so I can get this surface cleaned up. There are oils on it from the factory, that way it doesn't rust sitting on the shelf. So with some brake parts cleaner and a clean rag, get all the oils off. With that cleaned up, take it, flip it around, install it the right way. Want to make sure you line up this hole with the threads on the bearing on the hub. There we go, that lines up. So that way we can put our set screw in, but for now let's finish cleaning the outside. Take that T40 bit and the set screw, put it back in. Snug it up just a little bit. If yours is in poor condition, you don't necessarily have to put this back on, but if it's in good condition, it does help because it keeps the rotor from wobbling around as you work. I also recommend putting a little bit of anti-seize on its threads, that way it doesn't get stuck in the future. With our brake caliper on a workbench, let's remove the slider pins from it so that we can clean it. There's a lot of debris here around the boot where the slider pin seals up, so I'm going to clean that off first, that way it doesn't get inside. Mine is nice and free. If yours is stuck, you would have to unseize it. Hopefully yours is not. Looks like I have a lot of grease here still. That's a good sign. I'm going to wipe this off, that way I can add new grease. I'm not so worried about the inside of the boot here, or the bore of the slider, because the grease is good. If you had very old, gunky grease, you would want to, well, basically do this. The boot just fell off, but you would want to remove it, clean inside there. Since this came off, I'm going to apply a thin layer of grease right around the lip here, where it seals up. That's going to provide the perfect seal for that boot. I'm using silicone paste that is rated for high temperatures, by the way. It's rated for brakes. You want to either use brake grease or this silicone paste. Whatever you're using, you don't want it to melt. I put a little bit of grease inside the boot. The folds of the boot will basically act as a reserve of grease. I'm going to put a little bit on the slider pin itself, but you can't put too much because it'll get wiped off as you try to slide it back in the caliper. Having said that, slide the slider pin all the way in. You'll notice that there's air stuck in here that's going to want to push it out. That's okay. Press it, squeeze the boot. That's going to release the air. Doing this a few times will eventually get you with almost no air. As you can see, it pulls a vacuum when I pull it. This is perfect. It all slides around smoothly. So let's flip this around, do the same to the other side. The reason I do these one at a time is because one of them will actually have rubber bushing. That one did not, so it must be this one right here. As you can see, has a black rubber bushing here, which is important that it goes back to exactly where it came from. Work that grease in, slide it through, press it in all the way, squeeze all the air out. If you put too much grease at this point, all the excess grease will also come out. But try not to put too much in, otherwise it can prevent proper operation of the brakes. One more thing we have to do is to get these anti-rattle clips off. This is not in too bad of shape, so with a wire brush, I'm going to clean all of this debris off. A lot of this is just sand buildup, a little bit of rust, but not too bad. If yours was extremely corroded, you'd want to sand it down or file it down. Just be very careful not to remove too much material. Like I said, a wire brush will do the trick for me. This is very clean, so I'm going to rinse it with brake parts cleaner. Once that's dry, I'm going to apply a very thin layer of brake grease or silicone paste, whatever you're using. That way this doesn't corrode in the future. And I'm doing this underneath the anti-rattle clips so that water doesn't collect in there and corrode the caliper. If you didn't clean it up enough and there is already corrosion in here, what will happen is the pads will not have enough space, top and bottom, and they will actually get squished between the two anti-rattle clips. That would not be good. That would cause braking issues. With that done, take your new anti-rattle clips and clip them on. Make sure they're centered and make sure they bottom out and lock in. Flip it over and do the same on this side. All right, that's installed. Let's get the caliper back on the car. Slide the caliper over and line up the two bolts. Start them into their threads. Once you start one, you'll be able to let go so you can start the other. This bottom one is going to be a little trickier to reach and start, but you should be able to get it eventually. Once you do have them started, snug them up. The torque on both of these bolts is 74 foot-pounds and an additional 15 to 30 degrees. A better reference would be an eighth of a turn, which is 45 degrees, so basically just a little bit extra after 74 foot-pounds. That's 74 right there. I'll just give it a little extra. That's good. Let's do the same to the upper one. That's 74 and a little extra. Let's put the pads in. The outer pad does not get a wear indicator, so you'll have two pads without and two pads with. Make sure this one is without. And the inner one will have a wear indicator sitting on the top. Put it in at an angle. That'll make it easier for it to slide into position. And once you angle it, press it in. The pads should slide nice and smooth in here. If they're stuck, that means you didn't clean up enough and they're getting squished. That's what I meant earlier. Next, we have to push the piston of the caliper back in so we can make space for the newer, thicker pads. There's a lot of debris buildup here, sand and grease, old grease that is. Someone has lathered this in grease, and that is actually not quite recommended because of this. It builds up a lot of debris over time, and it can actually cause damage to where this boot seals up on the piston. So I'm going to clean all of this off, get it looking nice and degreased. I don't want to use brake parts cleaner on this because I don't want to damage the boot. This is looking perfect, so now let's press that piston in. Remove the bleeder screw boot or cap with an 11mm wrench or socket. Break this bleeder screw free. You might not necessarily have to do this, but I do recommend doing that. And to make less of a mess, I actually have a piece of hose here that I'm going to attach to the bleeder screw so that when I push the fluid out, it won't just shoot straight up. It'll go through the hose into my collection bucket. I'm going to keep the bleeder screw at the top of the caliper, meaning I won't turn it upside down. That way any air can go up and through the bleeder screw. I'm going to take my caliper depression tool and push that piston in nice and slow. It should go very smoothly. If it does not, that means you have a problem in the caliper. That was extremely easy, which is what it's supposed to be. Let it sit for a second just so any air can make its way up. If you don't have one of these hoses, it should just clear up already. If you have something to put on here, like I said, it does help minimize the mess. Snug this up, remove my hose, take that 11mm wrench, snug it up properly. If there is a lot of brake fluid here, clean it up. If not, reinstall the cap. Sometimes you'll notice that the boot on the piston gets pushed out like this. This is just air stuck behind it. Take a thin screwdriver, little one, try to peel it away just like that. That should release any air that's stuck back there. Be very careful not to puncture it though. At this point, we can put the caliper over the pads, just like this. Get the 2 bolts that go into the slider pin and slide those through. Make sure they start nice and smoothly by hand. You may or may not have to hold that slider pin again. It looks like I do. Snug these up. Don't worry about tightening them too much. We will be torquing them in a second. The torque for these is 30 foot-pounds. Now you'd want to do the same thing on the other side. Pump up that brake pedal, and let's put the wheels on. Get that wheel back on. Put back all 5 of your lug nuts. In a cross pattern, we'll snug them up. And then also in a cross pattern, we'll torque them to 100 foot-pounds. With only a little bit of pressure on the wheel, torque them to 100 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them. Now that you've finished installing your rear brakes, pump up that brake pedal until it's nice and firm. That'll seat the pistons of the caliper up against the pads and of course up against the rotor. Then without pressing the brake pedal, hold the ignition button or the start button. That way the ignition turns into the on position. At this point, hook up your scan tool again and let's reset the parking brake and seat those motors. I'm going to go back into anti-lock brakes, functional tests, output controls, and we'll go all the way down to rear brake caliper piston extend. So of course, once again, make sure that brake pedal is pumped up. I'm going to select that. Once we're ready to do so, we're going to extend or apply the parking brake through the scan tool. That just completely applied the parking brake. So at this point, we should be good to go. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes the parking brake light will start flashing after you have reset it from the scan tool, and that is because it's either not calibrated or it didn't fully re-engage, so to speak, and it is very common on these vehicles. So what you can do at that point, if your scan tool won't calibrate it and just won't respond to anything, is you want to just turn on the engine. On these vehicles, they're programmed to release the parking brake no matter what if you put it in drive or reverse and start driving. So make sure you have plenty of space and you're in an area where you can actually do this. Have your foot on the brake, put it in drive, let go of the brake pedal, and there you have it. Parking brake has now been disengaged or released. At this point, you can put it back in park, press on the parking brake button to actuate it. That just set the parking brake, release it. Everything should work perfectly fine now. Since the bleeder screws were open and we took out some fluid from the system, open up the master cylinder reservoir, make sure there's not a lot of debris around it. On it, you'll see that it says .3 brake fluid. So I'm going to add some fresh .3 brake fluid all the way to the max line. Top it off all the way to the max line. At this point, I'm going to close this off. And there you have it. Take it for a road test and make sure everything works as it should.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.